If you've considered rental property as a source of income, something you might want to invest in, I would love to share with you some things I have learned as a landlord over the past 20 years that can be helpful to you before you make your investment. First off, I'd just like to say, obviously, rental income is a great source of income, but some other things to consider are that you can buy a multifamily property and live in one unit and rent out the others to offset your mortgage so that you're there to maintain it. You could buy a vacation property and use that as a way to get a vacation, but then also rent out the property when you're not there. Just make sure you tell your lender that's what your plan is. Or another thing to think about is that you can buy the property, use it as a way to invest so that you can pay for college or help offset costs of retirement by selling the property at the right time. Just remember that it is a passive source of income, but it's not truly passive. There are a lot of things you need to keep in mind to make your investment a good investment. So, for the uninitiated, there are a lot of things that come along with owning rental property that you may not be expecting. I'm going to share a couple tips with you on things that I've experienced and ways that you can maybe make your experience better. So, for example, I one time received a call from a tenant that they were in an argument with the tenant above them because the tenant above them had had a kid since they moved in, and the kid was walking around and that noise was bothering the first floor tenant. So in retribution, the first floor tenant was playing music loudly. So I received calls from both tenants complaining about the other one. These were tenants that I had inherited when I bought the property, and I was out of town at the time, so I had to counsel them both over the phone to kind of keep the peace until I returned home. And then I created, when I got home, a list of policies for each tenant to sign off on, basically stating that they would treat each other respectfully until they moved out, and if they couldn't, that their lease would end early. This brings up the point that you've got to really screen people carefully when you lease to them. You can use a screening service, but I think it's a good idea to meet them in person and talk about expectations, and then have a list of policies once you do decide to choose a tenant so that they know what the expectation is, especially with a multifamily property where people are living close to each other. Another thing to keep in mind when you own rental property is that there's a lot of maintenance required and things come up unexpectedly. Recently on a holiday, I got a call from a tenant that her furnace wasn't working and it was 0 degrees out. Turned out that it was just that she hadn't changed her filter. I was able to pick up a filter at a local hardware store and change it myself, and the furnace continued to work and the house warmed up properly. But this brings up an important issue. I thought she was changing the filters, turns out she wasn't, and so I've now created a regular maintenance calendar for myself to go check on those things and make sure they're getting done so that the furnace doesn't burn out. You need to have regular maintenance schedules for all of the big mechanicals so that this doesn't happen to you. So when you do have a big issue, especially on a weekend or an evening, you want to have a good list of contractors that you can call on to take care of those issues. If it's something you can't fix yourself, you need to have a good HVAC person, electrician, plumber, roofer, etc. Because things come up at random hours and you don't always know when it's going to be. And if you have contractors that think of you as a repeat customer that you send lots of business to, they're going to be more likely to respond to your needs on those off hours, or at least make you first on their list when they are going to get back out to work. So make sure you have a great list of contractors. So another thing that's happened to me in the last couple of years was I got a call from a first floor tenant that there was water pouring through his ceiling on a Sunday morning. Of course, my first reaction was to panic, but I tried to roll with the punches. I called the upstairs tenant. Turned out he had an out-of-town relative who had used the bathtub and didn't know how to operate the drain and had managed to overflow it. We were able to get everything cleaned up and dried out, but had I made sure that tenant used the drain properly and had he made sure his relative did, we could have prevented this. So I always try to go over at the beginning of a lease with my tenants how everything operates in the apartment. As a landlord, I got a call one time from a tenant who didn't know how to change a light bulb in his bathroom ceiling fan. It sounds kind of laughable, but the reality was he had no idea. He'd never owned a home. He hadn't had to do this in his parents' home. Many of my tenants are young professionals, but they haven't maintained a home themselves. So instead of, saying do it yourself, I grabbed my ladder, grabbed some bulbs, went over. I showed him how to do it so the next time he could do it. But I also realized another issue was that it took a special bulb, and he didn't have a ladder. So now what I try to do is I always leave ladders in the basements of my properties so that tenants can change their own light bulbs, and I try to leave some extras. I know it shouldn't be my job to pay for the bulbs, but it can make the relationship go a lot smoother and make the property better maintained if you keep some basic supplies for your tenants at the house. As a landlord, some people use rental property management companies. My experience has been you have to find a very good rental property manager or do it yourself. By laying eyes on the property yourself, you're able to keep up with what's going on and prevent bigger problems from developing. A good example of that is when I went with my husband to mow a property, which we do have a landscaper now, but this was early on, and discovered that the tenant's teenage grandson had set up a clubhouse in our garage, thereby making it difficult for the first floor tenant to use the garage and just having some activities that we didn't want in our property. So if we hadn't been over there, we wouldn't have known about this. So, again, it's a good idea to be the person to upkeep and check on your property regularly. I mentioned policies with your tenants. It's really important to have strong policies about animals and adopting animals once they're your tenant. I always talk to the tenant about whether I allow pet or not beforehand. I often collect pet deposit or do pet rent, but sometimes a tenant will decide they want to adopt a pet while they're already in your property. You need to make that clear in your policy whether or not you allow that and what the parameters are. I've always said that I need to meet the pet. I want to make sure it's not an aggressive animal, and if I don't have a yard, I don't want them to have a dog. And I've discovered not that long ago when a tenant had adopted a dog and failed to mention when we went to mow and saw some evidence. So again, that's another reason why you want to regularly check on your own property. Although owning rental property is a great source of income, it's also costly, and you want to make sure you're setting aside 10 to 20% of your rental income as a reserve to cover unexpected costs. An example for me was when my sewer lateral backed up in a tenant's basement, and we discovered it wasn't just a small, scoping out the line kind of issue, but we had to replace an entire sewer lateral, which ended up costing over $10,000. Had we not saved the reserve money, we would have been left high and dry and scrambling to figure out how to cover that cost. If you have other questions or thoughts about owning rental property, I'd love for you to leave them in the comments. If you have an interest in becoming a landlord, or you want to get rid of a multifamily because it's not for you and you're in the St. Louis area, please give me a call or message me, and I'd be happy to help.